I wanted to ask about one piece in particular in the show by Broomberg and Channerin from 2008, and it's The Day Nobody Died.
Mm-hmm.
And from my understanding, it's this, it's an abstract piece. It's a piece of photographic paper that they took to Helmand province
Mm-hmm.
in Afghanistan and exposed to the sunlight for 20 seconds on a day that nobody died. And from my understanding, the piece is, it's not meant to just be an abstraction of war or some sort of lofty contribution in artistic terms to photography and war, but rather that it's more about the politics of representation in war,
Mm-hmm.
in the way that media deals with representation in war,
Mm-hmm.
and the things that are unseen. And I just wondered if you could expand a little bit about that work and its inclusion in the show, and also maybe how that abstraction works out in the context of other works where there is palpable or recognizable forms of representation of conflict.
Yeah, well, it's a really important work, and it's also really important where it is in the show. I mean, it's in a room with Don McCullen's Shell Shock Marine from the Battle of Hue in 1968, and a Luc Delahaye work of an IED going off in Ramadi in Iraq. And really what those three works do is they propose three different sort of solutions to the problem of photographing the moment or the moment after something has happened. McCullen was obviously at that point a photojournalist, but he was a photojournalist long before the process of embedding happened. So he was, as he says, free to take the pictures that he wanted. He was free to publish the pictures that he wanted. And he always says, I mean, Don says this when he does a tour or he's talking about the work, that you cannot take that picture anymore. And even if you did take that picture of a Marine who just experienced combat, who was actually shell-shocked, and Don says that he just went up and took pictures in his face and he didn't blink, he didn't react in any way, he was completely traumatized. That even if you did take that picture now, it would be redacted, it wouldn't be allowed to be published. So the question is, what response do you have to embedding and to the new discourses around what's available and what's viable as a photograph? So Don's was a historic example, although interestingly it's a very large print actually. It's sort of produced more as a work for the museum wall. It's very deliberate. He does that with very few images, and there's probably like 4 or 5 of his photographs that he produces in that way. Delahaye is very well known for having been a photojournalist and then stopping being a photojournalist and kind of using a large format camera and taking what he considers to be a sort of tableau that sort of stand for conflict, but in one image rather than rattling off many images. And that's a fantastic image. I mean, the dust sort of hanging in the air, the precision, the feeling of being in the moment is really,
just being there.
It's really incredible. So it's a really interesting alternative to the sort of conventions of photojournalism. And on the other hand, if we had 3 hands, which we don't, but on the third hand, you've got Broomberg and Channerin, who sort of said, okay, if we're going to be embedded, how do we deal with this question of embedding? And what they say about the work is that really they weren't happy to have the images that they took and published or used controlled in any way. So they came up with an alternative, which was to produce images that rejected censorship by not being figurative. Now, it's a very controversial act because for many people and for many other photojournalists, they would see that embedding slot as very precious and maybe to some people it's wasted if you go there and you don't take pictures. But what they were really doing is, I think, referring to the indexical nature of the photograph. A photograph is about a passage of time. It's about light hitting a sensor in for a certain period. So their idea of exposing paper, and almost always when things were happening. So the one that's in the show is called The Press Conference, The Day Nobody Died. So it's the period, they unrolled it during the press conference on the day that nobody died. But many of the other works are when things had happened, so that they're signifying an event, an explosion or something by unrolling this paper. And there's a film that goes with the work, which actually we didn't have the space to include, but it's actually a remarkable film because then you really see they really were in armoured vehicles clattering around in the desert, fully in the mode of embedded. photojournalists. But I accept that it's a very controversial work, but I also believe that the other works that are with it contextualize it in a way and sort of suggest there are more than one ways to deal with this problem.
Yeah. I don't feel in any means that they have negated by any means the sort of impact of war or conflict. I think in a strange metaphorical way they've enabled it. For the titling of the piece in particular is a very specific function, and it does have it does transcend sort of being reportage or war photography into their sort of practice, which is what they
and many of the artists in the show have done this. In fact, I mean, if you think that what Simon Norfolk's response to being in Afghanistan was not to photograph the action, was to photograph the ruins of previous conflicts. Sophie Ristelhuber's decision to photograph around the conflict at the end, but still in an extremely unstable environment, with huge fires burning all over the desert. And really, I think these shifts are about different responses to the contemporary conditions of photojournalism. And I think that the arrival of what may look like photojournalistic images into the galleries and into museums puts pressure on the conventions of that practice.